So Alexander the Great combined the use of the phalanx. So like I was talking about, they were the linebackers. They held the line while his heavy cavalry exploited gaps in the enemy's formation. And he was so successful of this, he carved out this massive empire, as you can see, stretching all the way to India. He would have probably gone further, except for, depending on which account you read, the soldiers want to go home because they've been campaigning for about a decade or more. Though you can see also he maintained a supply route to maintain his host, so he didn't have to have his soldiers forage lands, which of course meant that it's easier for him to pacify the populations. And of course, after the death of Alexander the Great, his empire collapsed and broke into 4 separate empires. And moving on, so the rise of the Roman Republic. As you'll see with the Roman Republic, their military was class-based. You have the Histati, which was the younger class of infantry. They were the front line. They were armed with a gladius, a pilla, and a scudum, which is a shield. So the gladius was a short sword, and the pilla was a form of a javelin, where the soldier would throw the javelin, and its job was to bend on impact on the enemy's shield. It would bend, weighing it down, so that allowed the skirmishers to be able to hit their opponent's shield. And then you have the princeps, which were the veterans, the seasoned warriors. They were able to afford better armor and equipment. And you have the triarii, which are the oldest and wealthiest members of the Roman society, and they somewhat resembled the Greek hoplites. And how the battle formation was, you had the Histati, they were in the front row, the front rank. When they would engage the enemy and unable to break through, they would fall back, and then the princeps would engage, and then the triarii would follow afterwards. So pretty much the main strategy is have the youngest be the cannon fodder, soften up the enemy, and the princeps would go in and be the ones that break the formation, hopefully winning the day. Oh, forgot to mention, yeah, here's the gladius. You see it's a rather short, stabbing sword, because they held these big shields. And of course, the main bonus of having these big shields and stabbing swords is they were able to form compact ranks. And as we see here, the standard legionary helmet, and then of course the pilla, the javelin, right here. We have the Gaius Marius reforms of the army, which this came to compensate for the short of manpower after a series of civil wars amongst the Roman elite, and is no longer class-based. It removed wealth and age requirements, and you can form a career. You serve for 25 years, and you are guaranteed a plot of land and form a retirement. And you are considered hero, and you are a citizen of the Roman Empire. And their job was to Romanize a newly conquered province. The part of the Romans' economy was based on expansion. One of the big motivations for constructing roads and forts was to be able to move the legions across the empire. And if you look at a map of the Roman Empire, you'll see why they were close around the Mediterranean, is to be able to ship their troops and maintain trade relations with the provinces. And of course, their goal for expansion was also gaining slaves. Slaves were the economic backbone that created food for the empire and goods and commodities. And when the Roman legion stopped expanding, pretty much they stopped at the Rhineland, their economy would stagnate and eventually collapse. And of course, there are multiple reasons why the Roman Empire fell, depending on who you ask, but it's not just one answer. It was because of the barbarian or the barbarism of the legions, which what it means by the barbarism of the legions is the Roman Empire's legions relied heavily on the barbarians coming in to serve in their legions. When the Roman Empire collapsed, there was reestablishment of society under feudalism. As we talked about, the feudal knight, they were one of the ruling classes. You had the king, nobles, which most of them were knights, and then you have the peasants. And so for the feudal knight, what we see right here, they had layers of what's called gambeson, which is quilted jackets. It served as a base layer when applying for chainmail and plate armor. During the 12th and 11th century, they were using what's called mail or chainmail. What chainmail is tiny interlocked rings. And it takes about 540 man-hours to make one shirt. And misconception people think is, oh, well, chainmail, because the tight rings, it's to prevent archers and bows and arrows. Actually, it's mostly against cutting. And I just use an example here of what's called a knight hospitalier. So, as feudalism was being established in Europe, you had the Mongolian Empire, which I jokingly refer the fan fiction of world history that people talk about but really don't know much about, because people like to describe the Roman Empire being one of the biggest empires of the world, while the Mongolian Empire, they stretch from China to parts of Russia and almost getting into Europe. So what's fascinating about the Mongolian Empire is the right of rule was based on the ability to wage war. And of course you had Genghis Khan, who was the one driving the Mongolian invasion. And of course his children would take up the mantle to expand westward. So, and of course they implemented a form of meritocracy to ensure loyalty. So if you were a valuable warrior, you had a chance of raising up in ranks, more loot, and titles. And of course, their weapon of choice, it was a composite bow. And what a composite bow is layers of wood and bone, composite, so multiple materials made up the bow, and this made it a lot stronger and is shorter so that they can ride on horseback and shoot. As we talked about the steppe nomads and following the grassland migration, the Mongolians, they relied on horseback for hunting and, of course, warfare. In fact, each rider had about 16 spare horses each. So that's quite a bit of horses. They utilized both light and heavy cavalry. So light cavalry would be used for harrying the flanks or shooting on horseback. And heavy cavalry, similar to knights, they were the ones with the couched lances, charge in to break the formations. And one of the popular tactics of the Mongolians was the use of feigning a retreat. So they would go up to the ranks with a small force, attack, usually pepper them with a few volleys of arrows, and now draw the force in as they would retreat. And when the enemy would try to chase them, that would draw them into the larger Mongolian force. And this was comparable to the hunting, like trying to chase out game. And the Mongols use rather unorthodox tactics. They would set fire to fields, use dummies, decoys, and spies. And most of the time they would incorporate the technology of the territories that they conquered into their arsenal, and of course the troops as well. And one of the other outcomes of the Mongolian Empire was the reestablishment of the Silk Road, which of course facilitated trade between China and to Europe. And this, throughout world history, ebbed and flowed. There would be contact. There are sources of the Roman Empire sending delegates to China, so they had some contact. And then when the Roman Empire fell, the contact was broke. And then when the Mongols formed their empire, and when the Crusades happened, that's where the Europeans once again got a taste of the Chinese commodity we'll see resulting in colonialism. Now, one of the innovations of bringing down the knight was the crossbow. And there are instances of the crossbow being used throughout European history. It originated in China. It had use in Europe, small instances. It was considered an unchivalric weapon. Depending on what you read, people will say, oh, well, the Pope banned crossbows. In truth, it was discouraging the use of crossbows against other Christians. It's fair game in the Crusades or non-Christians, but let's face it, when it comes to conflict and wanting to win, knight or noble is not going to really care what about not allowed to use the crossbow. The benefit of the crossbow, it gives a lesser trained warrior the upper hand. You can pretty much train a peasant to point and shoot pretty well in a short amount of time. And that crossbow, since it's smaller, needs a heavier draw to be able to project that bolt. And it can puncture through chainmail and some points of plate armor. As we see in the picture, the disadvantage is the slow reload time. The gentleman on the right, he shot his crossbow, and he has to literally lay down and draw the crossbow with his full body to be able to reload and fire. So some crossbowmen would have a giant shield on their back, so that when they fire, they can pop squat and reload their crossbow with a shield on their back without getting peppered in return. And here's some examples of the crossbows. And as you can see right here, this was a crank. So if you had a bigger crossbow, you would need that crank to reload it, to draw the string back, load the bolt, and fire. And of course, you'll see here some firearm.